Colonel Douglas McGregor joins us to discuss. Colonel, great to see you.
Good to see you.
So
I certainly do not regard this as a major escalation.
You do not. You do not.
No. And I'll tell you why. First of all, this is an air and missile defense system that was designed really to do two things: destroy incoming tactical ballistic missiles and aircraft. Its record is not perfect, but it's a good system. It's a very fragile system, a very expensive system. We're talking about sending 7 or 8 launchers. Normally, I shouldn't even say normally, but you can have as many as 8 launchers in one battery. If you do that, that gives you about 128 missiles loaded up in the launchers that can be fired at these tactical ballistic missiles or aircraft. Now, it could also be used against cruise missiles, but that's not what it was designed for, and it doesn't perform nearly as well against cruise missiles and low-flying unmanned aircraft as it does against high-speed aircraft and tactical ballistic missiles. The most that they could do is protect what I would call a high-value target. You could put a certain number of these launchers around a headquarters or a command and control node, potentially an ammo storage area if you thought that was, very sensitive. The problem is that that's all it can do. You're not going to be able to protect Kiev. You're not going to be able to protect Lvov, any of the major cities in Ukraine, portions of them only. In other words, this is a point defense system. To have an impact on this war, you would need 10 battalions. 10 battalions would end up being about 1,280 missiles loaded up. This is going to give you maximum, perhaps 128 missiles. The second part of this is every time you engage a target, you tend to fire 2 missiles at the target. Well, you're going to end up with lots of targets at any given point in time, and that's by design. The Russians know from experience how to overwhelm air defense systems. You will run out of missiles long before you do much damage. And then lastly, it's very hard to move. This is a very fragile equipment. The radars are sensitive. The slightest damage will put it out of action. And then you have to have highly trained soldiers. Now, I'm told that we've been training Ukrainians in Germany. Well, that's fine. But I doubt very seriously that we would send this equipment anywhere in Ukraine unless we sent along with it U.S., German, or Polish officers who are experienced on the system. This is not something that you train up on for a couple of weeks and then go to war. We send soldiers to 6 months of intensive schooling and training to operate these systems. So the bottom line is this going to have an impact? If so, what's it going to be? It'll be marginal impact. And by the way, it's very expensive. Depending upon which missile you fire, and there's several different types, they cost between $3 and $6 million a piece.
For each missile? For each missile? Holy.
Yeah, and we do not have, we don't have inventories of these missiles to the point where we can afford to fire them endlessly. We're back to the problem of how many missiles do we have on hand, and we don't have assembly lines. This is not the sort of thing that you stamp out at Ford's automobile factory. You actually have to have skilled technicians putting these parts together on each missile individually. So the speed with which you could build more missiles is limited by the numbers of technicians that you had to work on the missile components.
It's unbelievable. So just the math on this for a second. $3 million per missile to shoot down arguably $30,000 Russian drones, right? And we now know that Russia can, if that's what they're going to shoot down, what are they aiming for with these? Just protection?
Well, they'll probably try to shoot down tactical ballistic missiles. This is the Russian Iskander missile, which is very accurate and has a large warhead on it. And the Russians have, we estimate, at least 50 to 100 launchers that could launch Iskander missiles at any given point in time. And again, it would not be hard to overwhelm this one missile battery. I mean, you're talking about 7 or 8 launchers. That's one battery. You'd need 10 battalions to protect Ukrainian forces on the ground and key points across the country. That if you were going to war, that's what you would send, 10 battalions. We don't have that to send. Ukrainians can't man them.
So I'm a glass half full kind of guy, and so I feel like, well, this is good news. This is not an escalation. This is just more of the same. We're going through our warehouses, and we're finding out some of the old stock that we've got. You know, it's like trying to send a Christmas gift at the last minute to Ukraine, which Zelensky admitted this week 50% of his country now has no electricity. 50%. I've heard reports it's even higher than that. So then that sounds like good news. And so it sounds like this is not an escalation, but now we're just sitting here watching the Ukrainian army be devastated, decimated, totally removed as they keep trying to throw troops at this sort of steel wall. And Russia doesn't have to do anything, it looks like. They can just sort of sit back and absorb all of this now. Am I wrong?
Well, I think you're half right. The Russians don't have to do a great deal, and they aren't at the moment. I mean, the vast majority of their forces are preparing for these offensive operations that will be launched whenever the theater commander decides it's the right time. He's been waiting for an improvement in the weather, that is, for ground to freeze. He's been waiting for all the reservists to be fully integrated. Once he's satisfied that everything's in place, he'll launch, whenever that is. That could come tomorrow morning, or it could come in February. We have no way of knowing. But in the meantime, Ukrainians are fighting tenaciously against the Russians in the south, and they're trying to hold on to this place called Bakhmut, which is being built as a logistical hub because of its connectivity to rail lines and transportation assets. And they're losing it, and they're losing thousands of troops in the process. The Russians, meanwhile, are taking very few casualties. The exchange rate between Russia and Ukraine is about 1 to 8 or 1 to 10. So for every 8 or 10 Ukrainian soldiers that are killed, only one Russian soldier is killed. That's not a good exchange. And we think that the entire Ukrainian army, excluding foreigners, that is the thousands of Polish troops in uniform or Americans and Brits and others that may be there as mercenaries, is about 194,000 effectives. In other words, everybody else is wounded or dead. And the people that they're throwing in to these positions are untrained. They're showing up with 2 or 3 weeks of preparation, if that. Here's a weapon, get on the truck, you're headed forward. And they climb into these trenches, and essentially they wait around to be destroyed. And that's what the Russians are doing. It's a tragic situation. No one in their right mind would do this. And that's why I'm saying these Patriot missiles, I'm beginning to think this is a gesture. This is so sometime in the spring, American and European leaders could say, well, we did all we could. We sent them everything we had, and we just couldn't make it work. Well, this is crazy. Right. This never had any chance of success to begin with. They're lying to everybody about everything.
And so then what's next? I mean, we heard from Jens Stoltenberg just last week, worried in an interview that this could spiral out of control, not be able to put this genie back in the bottle. So is this right now the West, NATO, trying to find an off-ramp in this? Or are we looking to take things to the next level?
Well, the next level, one sees ground offenses begin, would be nuclear. And I don't see any evidence that anyone in their right mind in Washington or anywhere else in NATO wants to go nuclear. It's very clear the Russians do not. So I don't see that occurring. To be quite frank with you, we're going to reach a point in time, and I don't know when it'll be, but it'll be probably in the next 90 days, where we can no longer conceal the catastrophe on the ground in Ukraine, where Russian forces have overwhelmed and destroyed virtually all of the Ukrainian armed forces. The country is in ruins. And he was saying that whatever happens, which is a change in words for him, he's usually said, you know, the Ukrainian Victory March, which began on 24 February, continues, right? He's now saying, well, whatever happens, which means he knows they're going to lose and lose badly, there will never be a good rapport with Russia. We can't go back to business as usual. Our relations will always be poisoned. Well, that sounds to me like they're preparing themselves for the disaster. And again, that's why I think this is a hedge against the very high probability that people are going to stand up and say, well, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? They're throwing things at Ukraine that Ukraine cannot assimilate and cannot employ. And we're sending more Westerners over there in Ukrainian uniform as contractors or soldiers to try and make up for it. It's not going to work. I think everybody knows that. But we're going to continue to the bitter end. And there's not going to be much left of Ukraine when they're through. So that's the first part. Second part is the Russians are exactly what you said. They're deliberate. They're methodical. They're going to put together these offensives. These offensives will be launched, I suspect, certainly when the ground freezes, no later than mid-November. and these offensives will sweep everything before them. And we, on the other hand, will sit there and say, well, we're sorry, we did all we could, and the Ukrainian people will suffer for it. We have no strategy. We simply have no strategy. There is no systematic approach that defines the desired end state, how to achieve that end state, and what the real purpose of the mission is. If you ask anyone, what are we doing in Ukraine? The answer is, well, we're degrading Russia to make sure Russia can never do this again. It's all nonsense. There is no specific end state other than, let's see if we can destroy Russia. Ukraine is an opportunity for us. We'll intervene, we'll set up a government, and then we'll exploit the Ukrainian people to weaken Russia, and perhaps we'll be successful, and we'll eliminate this obstacle to total global financial domination by the United States and the dollar. It's ridiculous nonsense. The World Economic Forum is part of it. The people in the West, the elite class is part of this. It was a terrible miscalculation. It's not going to work. It's going to fail miserably, and we are going to be in serious crisis. So the best answer I can give you is that these people were opportunists. They thought they could do something they can't. It's failing. It will fail. And the consequences for us will be enormous. I mean, look, NATO is really in ruins at this point. Anybody who looks at it objectively knows the Europeans are not mobilizing nor have any interest whatsoever in a war with Russia. They thought NATO existed to stop wars in Europe. They thought NATO's purpose was to avoid future wars. They thought the EU was there to promote peace and prosperity across borders. All of that has been turned on its head by Washington. Washington is failing. It won't work. All we have to do at this stage, I'm afraid, is take the abuse that we will from the mainstream media and from the politicians in Washington who will depict us as deranged traitors. But in the next 60 to 90 days, that picture will change tremendously. And when it does, we will do what we have always done. We will stop talking about Ukraine, change the subject, and talk about other things. Because in the final analysis, what happens in Ukraine has never mattered strategically to us. Remember, the presidents that you referred to before 1991 were guided largely by strategic interests. It doesn't make any difference whether you talk about George Bush, Jimmy Carter, Richard Nixon. Everyone tended to look very carefully at what the strategic interests of the United States were and what the strategic interests were of Russia, the Soviet Union, and China. We have cast that aside. It's a kind of blind arrogance informed, I'm afraid, only by ideology. The ridiculous notion that somehow or another we are the vanguard of a revolution that is sweeping the world. And this globalist revolution preaches the predominance of liberal democracy. Not that I've seen very much evidence for that lately in my own country, but they preach that, and they preach globalism as their principal ideology. In other words, that we're going to denationalize everybody, destroy borders everywhere, and we'll end up with some sort of one world government. It's all nonsense. But I think that's what's happened. Ideology has trumped interests. We've got to get back to understanding interests. And if we looked at ours, we looked at Russia's, we would understand that Russia has always had and always will a legitimate national security interest in Ukraine. And furthermore, if when you look at Russia's armed forces today, the size of these armed forces, it's absurd to suggest that Russia has any interest or plan to conquer Eastern Europe. It doesn't have the force to do it. So you can't have it both ways, Dmitry. You can't say on the one side, look at how incompetent and weak the Russians are. But, oh, by the way, if they succeed in Ukraine, they're all marching on Warsaw. It's absurd. Doesn't make any sense. We've got to get back to interests, but we need a completely new administration. Frankly, I think we need a new generation of leaders in Washington.